Welcome to another deep dive. You know I love it when we get such a mix of sources. This time you've brought news articles, blog posts, even some reflections on religious readings, huh?
It's a real grab bag of ideas.
It is. I'm excited to dive in. Like always, you know the deal. We'll see where the ideas take us. Today, we're going from the ethics of technology to the search for meaning, and even the philosophical implications of D&D, believe it or not.
That's the beauty of philosophy, though, right? You can find it everywhere if you know where to look.
Absolutely. Okay, let's jump in with this news piece that caught my eye. Exoskeleton ethics. Work. It's about, well, basically think Tom Cruise in Edge of Tomorrow, right?
Oh, yeah, with the power suit.
Exactly. But this is about real-life exoskeletons, suits that give people superhuman strength. And the article's looking at, how that impacts the workplace, all these ethical questions, like how do you ensure worker safety when some people are super strong?
And yeah, what about fair competition if not everyone has access to that technology?
Right. And the article even asks, what does it even mean to be able-bodied in that kind of world? I mean, it's crazy to think about.
It is, and this ties into this whole area of philosophy called transhumanism. It's this idea that technology will eventually allow us to transcend our human limitations.
Wow. And so then the question is, what does it even mean to be human?
Right, it's a huge question. And how do we use these technologies ethically? What are the boundaries?
That's mind-blowing. And it's not just physical strength, it's pushing boundaries. Like we've got another source here, Philosophy of Fun, Don't Steal Turns in D&D.
Dungeons and Dragons, really.
Yeah. And it's about this thing called turn stealing, basically, where one player dominates the game and doesn't let others have a chance.
Oh, okay, I see. I actually see how that connects. It's about fairness and collaboration, really.
Totally. Even in a game. Like, how much are you focused on individual enjoyment versus the enjoyment of the group as a whole?
Exactly. It's a balance, right? And that's something we deal with in all sorts of social situations, not just gaming. Like, how do you balance what you want with what's best for everyone involved?
That's so true. Like, has you ever been in a group project where you felt like someone was stealing your turn?
Oh, definitely. Or even just in a family discussion sometimes.
Right. So these philosophical ideas, they're not just theoretical. They're playing out in our everyday lives.
They really are. It's kind of like philosophy is the operating system running in the background, even when we're not aware of it.
Okay, so now we've talked about ethics, boundaries in the physical world, and now even in games. It makes you kind of step back and think bigger picture, right?
Absolutely. All these sources make you wonder about, meaning and how we make sense of a complex world, right?
You're right. Like we have these philosophical blog posts here, and some of them are grappling with deep questions. Like one asks, is it actually possible to put everything together into a single unified narrative?
That's a good one. I mean, we're always looking for answers, for reasons.
Right. Trying to find some sort of order in the chaos.
And I think we're hardwired for that in a way. Like our brains want to connect the dots.
Yeah. There's another quote from these blog posts that really stuck with me. It said, because common sense is never more than an inherited amalgam of past clarities and past confusions, the defenders of common sense are unlikely to enlighten us.
Oh, wow.
Right. It makes you rethink what you just take for granted as true, doesn't it?
It really does. It's a challenge to go beyond those assumptions, those ingrained beliefs, because a lot of what we call common sense is really just shaped by our culture or our own limited experience, right?
So true. So then how do we even start to make sense of all these different viewpoints, these different ideas about how the world works? I mean, we've got a mix of philosophies represented here.
Yeah. We've got ancient Greek philosophers like Epicurus.
Right.
He had some interesting things to say about wealth and freedom, by the way. He actually argued that a free person is unable to acquire great wealth because that is not easily achieved without enslavement to the masses or to the powers that be.
Whoa! That's like the opposite of what we're told today, isn't it?
Right. It makes you question our values, our priorities. What does it truly mean to live a good life?
Yeah. And then we also have Eastern philosophies, like those found in the Who Am I teachings. Like this one quote from Laozi, it says, "Way remains hidden and nameless, but it alone nourishes and brings to completion." It's like there's this deeper truth, this underlying principle that guides us, But it's not always obvious, really.
That's not always easy to see, but it's there.
It's like we're piecing together this philosophical puzzle.
Yeah.
And each of these sources, each of these philosophies, is giving us a different piece.
Exactly. And each piece helps us understand ourselves and the world a little bit better. Like it's all connected.
Yeah. Right. And that understanding, it's especially important in today's world, with all the division and polarization. And speaking of which, there's one article here that dives right into that. It's called, Forget the Pundits. Here's how philosophers see America's moral divide over Trump.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. This article's looking at how people can have such different views about what's right and wrong, what's just and fair.
Right. It's like, how can we be living in the same world but seeing it so differently?
Exactly. And the article's asking, like, how do our own philosophies, our own beliefs, shape the way we see things? And how does that contribute to these divisions?
I think that's a really important question to be asking, especially now.
Yeah. Like, are we even speaking the same language anymore?
In a way, maybe not. And that's something we need to figure out how to address.
Absolutely. Now, while we're on this topic of finding common ground and seeking deeper meaning.
You know, we also have some sources here that offer kind of a different perspective, a more spiritual one.
Oh, right.
Like this one on the Feast of the Presentation of the Lord. It's from a religious tradition, but it's talking about light and hope and, spiritual awakening, things that I think a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah, for sure. And then there's also that quote from Gary Snyder. What we'd hope for on the planet is creativity and sanity, conviviality, the real work of our hands and minds.
Yeah, that's a good one. It's like, what kind of world do we want to live in? What are we striving for?
Right. And Snyder's saying it's about creativity, connection, meaningful work.
And there's this sense of like being grounded in the world too, like working with our hands, not just our minds.
Thinking about this idea of finding meaning, it takes me back to something we were talking about earlier, this whole idea that common sense can be misleading.
Oh, right.
So, like, how does that play into this bigger question of truth? How do we know what's real, what's true, in a world where there's so much information, so many different perspectives?
Yeah, that's a huge question, especially these days. It's easy to feel lost, Like, who do you trust? What do you believe?
Totally. And one of the sources you sent, there's this quote that I think speaks to this. It's from Simone Weil. She says something about how I think it's the human soul possesses a whole arsenal of lies with which to put up a defense against ugliness.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful. It's like we protect ourselves from the truth sometimes.
Right. So then the question is, are we all just lying to ourselves?
Yeah, I don't think it's always intentional. It's more like our brains want to simplify things, make sense of things, and sometimes that means filtering information, focusing on what confirms our existing beliefs.
Right, right. Like those cognitive biases we hear about.
Exactly. Those mental shortcuts can be helpful, but they can also lead us astray.
So how do we avoid that? How do we make sure we're seeing things clearly?
Well, I think it starts with being aware of those biases.
Right.
And being willing to question our own assumptions, like being open to evidence that challenges what we think we know.
It's like intellectual humility.
Exactly. It's tough, though, right? To admit you might be wrong.
It is. But it's so important. And it makes me think about another thing that keeps coming up in these sources, this whole idea of the power of language.
Oh, right. Like how words shape our understanding of the world.
Yeah. Like we have this Oscar Wilde quote here. It says, words, mere words, how terrible they were, how clear and vivid and cruel, one could not escape from them. And yet what a subtle magic there was in them. They seemed to be able to give a plastic form to formless things, and to have a music of their own, as sweet as that of viol or of lute. Mere words. Was there anything so real as words?
Wow. Wilde really captures how powerful language is, huh?
Right. It could be used for good or bad. It could be used to create beauty, but also to hurt.
It can be used to manipulate and deceive, to create division, but it can also be used to inspire, to connect, to build understanding.
Exactly. So we have to be really careful with language, both how we use it and how we interpret it.
Absolutely. And it makes me think about that article on the moral divide in America. Like, do you think part of the problem is that we're not even speaking the same language anymore?
Oh, that's interesting. Like, we might be using the same words, but they mean different things to different people.
Right, like justice or freedom or rights. Those words can have very different meanings depending on your background, your experiences, your values.
That's so true.
Yeah.
So how do we bridge that gap? How do we even start to understand each other when we're starting from such different places?
Well, I think it requires a willingness to listen, to really listen to the other side, not just waiting for your turn to speak, but trying to understand where they're coming from.
It's empathy. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's not easy, especially when you disagree strongly with someone, but it's so important.
It's like remembering that even in our disagreements, we're all human beings. We all have our own stories, our own reasons for believing what we believe.
Right. And I think philosophy can help us with that, with developing that empathy, that understanding.
Absolutely. It gives us the tools to think critically, to question our own biases, to have those tough conversations in a respectful way.
And it reminds us that learning is a lifelong process. Like, we're never done figuring things out.
I'm wondering, can all this deep thinking actually lead to, a sense of hope? Like, can philosophy actually help us create a better world?
I think that's the hope, right? That these ideas, these tools, can help us make the world a more just place, a more compassionate place. But philosophy also reminds us that progress, it's not always a straight line. There are going to be setbacks,
Yeah.
challenges.
Yeah. Like, we can't just think our way to a perfect world.
Right. And sometimes it feels like we're taking steps backward instead of forward.
Speaking of which, there's one quote we haven't talked about yet. It's from Albert Camus. Nemesis, the goddess of measure. All those who have overstepped the limit will be pitilessly destroyed. Kind of a dark one.
Yeah, it's a bit intense, isn't it? But I think there's a message there about humility, about recognizing that we're not all powerful. There are limits to what we can control.
Right. And maybe even a warning about, like, the consequences of overreaching, of thinking we know more than we do.
Yeah. Like trying to play God in a way.
So how do we navigate those challenges, those setbacks? How do we stay hopeful when things get tough?
Well, one of the blog posts you sent, it talks about this. It says, keep absorbing everything that happens, leaving nothing out.
So like being present in the moment.
Yeah. And it also says, keep asking questions and pushing our investigation of ourselves and the world further without end.
So it's like stay curious, keep learning, keep searching.
Exactly. Even when it's difficult.
Because there's always something more to discover.
Always. And
Yeah.
even in those dark times, I think that's where we can find hope, in that sense of wonder, that desire to keep learning and growing.
I like that. It's like even when things are bad, there's still beauty to be found. There's still meaning to be made.
Absolutely. And we have the power to choose how we respond to those challenges, to those dark times. We can let them crush us, or we can use them as an opportunity to learn, to grow, to become more resilient.
So it's not about ignoring the bad stuff. It's about finding a way to move forward, to keep going.
Right. And I think that's where philosophy can be so helpful. It gives us these tools, these frameworks for thinking about these big questions, for making sense of the world, even when it's chaotic and confusing.
It's like a compass, in a way. It can help us find our way when we're feeling lost.
Exactly. And it reminds us that we're not alone in this, that people have been grappling with these questions for centuries. And their insights can guide us, can inspire us, can give us hope.
I love that. It's funny. We started this deep dive talking about exoskeletons and D&D, and now we're talking about the meaning of life.
That's the thing about philosophy, right? It takes you to unexpected places.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it makes you realize that these big questions, they're not just for philosophers, they're for all of us.
Exactly. We're all philosophers in a way. We're all trying to make sense of the world to find our place in it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought. What will you take away from this conversation? What insights will you carry with you as you navigate the complexities of life?
How will you use these philosophical tools to make sense of the world, to find meaning and purpose, to create a more just and compassionate society?
And remember, the journey of philosophical exploration, it's never really over. It's an ongoing process of questioning, learning, growing. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked your curiosity and inspired you to keep asking those big questions.